The world doesn't humiliate you because you're weak. It humbles you because you have nothing it respects. The words hadn't even fully settled in Sophie Bennett's chest before the laughter hit her from 3 different directions, sharp and casual like it belonged there. Like she was the mistake in the room and everyone else was just correcting it. And for a second, she stood frozen at the edge of the polished marble floor, clutching a worn leather wallet that felt lighter than it should, her fingers tightening as the server's polite smile faded into something thinner, something colder, the kind of expression people in places like this reserved for people like her. And behind him, the low golden lighting of the restaurant made everything look expensive, untouchable. Every glass reflecting a life she wasn't part of, every quiet conversation reminding her that she didn't belong. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. "Ma'am, I'm going to need a valid form of payment," the server said, his voice still controlled but no longer kind. And Sophie swallowed hard, glancing down at the receipt, the numbers, sitting there like a quiet accusation. She had calculated everything twice before walking in. Every dollar, every tip, every tax. But something had gone wrong. Something always did. And now the eyes were on her. Not curious, not sympathetic, just waiting, watching, measuring. A woman at the next table leaned slightly toward her companion, whispering something behind a manicured hand. And even without hearing it, Sophie felt it land, felt the weight of judgment settle over her shoulders heavier than the threadbare coat she wore. "I can fix this," Sophie said quickly, her voice steady in a way she didn't feel, already pulling out crumpled bills, counting them again even though she knew the number wouldn't change, not by magic, not by hope. And for a brief second the entire room seemed to slow, like it was giving her one last chance to prove she deserved to stay. But then the server exhaled softly, not rude, just final. "I'm sorry," he said, and that was when it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet movement from the corner of the room. A man no one had noticed, sitting alone near the window where the city lights bled into the glass, stood up, his coat simple, almost worn, his presence unremarkable in a place that celebrated being seen. And he walked forward with an ease that didn't match his appearance, didn't match the assumption everyone would make at first glance. And without saying a word, he placed a folded bill on the edge of the table between Sophie and the server, not looking at either of them, not waiting for acknowledgement, just setting it down like it belonged there, like this moment wasn't worth attention. And then he turned, already walking away before Sophie could react, before she could process the sudden shift. The server paused, confusion flickering across his face before he picked up the bill, unfolded it slightly, and everything about his posture changed, the tension dissolving, the polite smile returning as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just been on the edge of being asked to leave. "You're all set," he said, and Sophie blinked, her breath catching as she looked toward the door where the man had already disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but the echo of a moment no one else seemed to care about. But for her, it felt like something had just shifted, something small, something quiet, something that didn't make sense yet. And as she stood there, heart still racing, she didn't realize that the man everyone would have dismissed as just another stranger had just stepped into her life in a way that would change everything she thought she understood about money, about power, and about the kind of person who chooses to help when no one is watching. Sophie stepped out into the cool night air, the city humming around her in that steady, indifferent rhythm that never paused for anyone. And for a moment, she just stood there on the sidewalk, clutching her wallet against her chest as if it might anchor her back into reality, her eyes scanning the passing faces, the flicker of headlights, the blur of strangers moving with purpose. But he was already gone. The man who had stepped in without a word and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind a question she could not shake, because people did not do that. Not here, not without wanting something in return, and yet he had not even waited for a thank you. "Wait," she said under her breath, the word dissolving into the night as she took a few quick steps forward, her gaze searching every direction. But there was no sign of him, no familiar coat, no lingering presence, just the city swallowing him whole like he had never been there at all. And slowly she exhaled, her shoulders dropping as the weight of the moment settled in, heavier now in hindsight than it had felt inside that restaurant. Because now she understood just how close she had been to being pushed out, erased, reduced to another story people would tell about someone who did not belong. And yet one quiet action had rewritten that ending, and she did not even know his name. A yellow cab rolled past, splashing light across the pavement, and Sophie glanced down at her hands, noticing for the first time how tightly she was still gripping the edge of that moment. Then she turned, walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks away, her steps slower now, more thoughtful, the rhythm of her heels against the concrete steady but distant, like her mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the way he had moved, the way he had not looked at her like she was a problem to solve or a situation to judge, just a person, and that alone felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. As she reached the corner, she adjusted her coat, pulling it closer against the wind, the fabric thin but familiar, a small comfort in a life that rarely offered much else. And as she waited at the crosswalk, she caught her reflection in the darkened window of a closed storefront, her hair slightly out of place, her expression still caught between embarrassment and something softer, something she could not quite name yet. And for the first time that night, the humiliation did not feel like the final note. It felt interrupted, like something had stepped in and quietly refused to let it define her. The bus arrived with a low mechanical sigh, doors opening as a few passengers stepped off, and Sophie climbed aboard, dropping a few coins into the fare box, the familiar routine grounding her. The driver nodding without much interest as she moved toward the back, taking a seat by the window, the city lights sliding past in streaks as the bus pulled away, and she leaned her head lightly against the glass, her thoughts drifting back again, not to the laughter, not to the stares, but to him, to the way he had walked in like he had nothing to prove and nothing to gain, and yet had changed everything in a matter of seconds. And somewhere between one stop and the next, Sophie found herself wondering something she had not expected, not why he helped, but who he really was, because there had been something in the way he carried himself, something that did not match the simplicity of his clothes, something quiet but undeniable, like a story hidden in plain sight. And as the bus continued through the city, Sophie did not realize that this was not the end of that moment, not even close. It was only the beginning of a connection that would pull her back to him again, not by coincidence, but by something that felt a lot like fate quietly refusing to be ignored. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just the dull gray light slipping through the thin curtains of Sophie Bennett's small apartment, the kind of place where the walls seemed to hold onto the cold no matter how high you turned the heat. And for a few quiet seconds she lay still on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer clarity, but all it gave her was the echo of last night, replaying in fragments that refused to fade. The laughter, the silence, and then him, always. Him, stepping in without hesitation, without explanation, like it was the simplest decision in the world. And that was the part that unsettled her the most, because nothing in her life had ever been that simple. A faint buzzing from her phone broke the stillness, and she reached over, blinking as she checked the time. 6:12 in the morning, earlier than she wanted, but exactly when she needed to be awake. Because her first shift started at 7, and being late was not an option when every hour meant groceries, rent, medication for her mother. She sat up slowly, pushing her hair back as she exhaled, grounding herself in routine, because routine was safe. Routine did not ask questions she could not answer. Within minutes she was dressed, pulling on her faded sneakers and grabbing her bag, her fingers brushing against the small stack of bills inside, thinner than it should have been, but no longer empty, not after last night. And that thought lingered as she stepped outside, locking the door behind her, the hallway, quiet except for the distant hum of someone else starting their day. Outside the air was crisp, carrying that early morning stillness that only lasted a short while before the city woke up fully, and Sophie moved quickly, her pace familiar, efficient, the route to the coffee shop just under half a mile, a distance she could walk in a little over 8 minutes if she kept steady, and she always did, because time was not something she had the luxury to waste. As she turned the corner onto Maple Street, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the block drifted toward her, warm and inviting, a small reminder of things she rarely allowed herself to indulge in. And just as she passed it, something made her slow down, not enough to stop, just enough to notice, because across the street, near a bus stop bench worn from years of use, sat a familiar figure, the same coat, the same quiet posture, The same presence that somehow did not demand attention but held it anyway, and Sophie felt her steps falter for the first time that morning, her eyes narrowing slightly as if confirming what her mind was already telling her. It was him, the man from last night, sitting there like he belonged to the background, like he had always been part of this street, unnoticed, unremarkable, except he was not to her, not anymore. She hesitated at the edge of the crosswalk, the light still red, cars passing in a steady stream, and for a brief second she considered just continuing on, pretending she had not seen him, because that would be easier, cleaner, safer, but something deeper pushed against that instinct, something that refused to let the moment pass without acknowledgement. And when the light finally changed, Sophie stepped forward, her heart beating just a little faster than usual, not from the walk, but from the quiet certainty that whatever had started last night was not finished, not even close. And as she approached, he glanced up, his expression calm, almost neutral, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, subtle but unmistakable. And in that instant, Sophie realized something that shifted everything just slightly off balance. This was not going to be a one-time encounter. This was the beginning of something she did not yet understand, but somehow already felt would matter more than she was ready for. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the early morning air stretching thin between them as the city slowly began to wake. And Sophie stopped just a few feet away, close enough to see the small details she had missed the night before, the faint crease at the edge of his sleeve, the way his hands rested loosely together as if he had nowhere urgent to be, and yet nothing about him felt careless. It felt intentional, controlled in a quiet way that did not match the image her mind had first assigned to him. "You disappeared pretty fast," she said finally, her voice steady but edged with curiosity, and his lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. "I did not think you needed an audience," he replied, his tone calm, measured, like every word had been considered before it was spoken, and Sophie let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding, nodding once as she glanced briefly at the empty seat beside him, then back at him. "You helped me," she said, more direct this time, because avoiding it felt impossible now, and he shrugged lightly, as if the moment had not carried the weight it clearly did for her. "It was nothing," he answered, but that only made her brow furrow slightly, because it had not been nothing, not to her, not in a place where people looked through you instead of at you, and she shifted her weight, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "It was not nothing," she said quietly, her voice softer now, more honest, and for the first time his gaze held hers a fraction longer, something unreadable passing through his expression before he looked away toward the street, watching a car pass like it gave him an excuse to break the moment. "Then I am glad it helped," he said, simple, clean, like he was closing the subject, but Sophie was not ready to let it close. Not yet, not when questions were stacking faster than answers. "Do you do that often?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, studying him now with a different kind of attention, the kind that looked past the surface. And he let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but did not quite reach that point. "Sit on benches," he replied, and this time she did smile, just a little, the tension easing for the first time since she walked up. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Help strangers." And there was a pause, not long, but long enough to matter, long enough for something unspoken to settle between them. "Only when it feels right," he answered. And Sophie felt that response land differently than she expected, because it was not about money, not about charity, it was about choice, about intention. And that made it harder to categorize him, harder to place him into the simple story her mind wanted to build. A bus pulled up behind them with a low hiss, the doors opening as a few people stepped off, and Sophie glanced toward it briefly before looking back at him, aware now of the minutes slipping by, her shift waiting, her routine calling her back to reality. But something in her resisted leaving just yet. "I should get to work," she said, though her feet did not move, and he nodded once, as if he had expected that from the beginning. "You are about 8 minutes away if you keep your pace," he said, and Sophie blinked, surprised by the accuracy, the detail, the quiet observation hidden in that simple statement, and it caught her off guard in a way she could not immediately explain, because people did not usually notice things like that unless they were paying closer attention than they let on. And as she took a small step backward, Preparing to leave, she hesitated just long enough to say one more thing. I am Sophie. And this time when he looked at her, there was something clearer in his expression, something more defined. Ethan, he replied, and the name settled into the space between them like the first real piece of something larger, something just beginning to take shape. And as Sophie finally turned and started down the street, her pace instinctively quickening, she could not shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a story that was going to ask more of her than she was prepared to give. And behind her, Ethan remained on that bench, watching her go with a calm that did not reveal the truth he was holding back, a truth that would eventually change everything she thought she understood about him. By the time Sophie pushed open the glass door of the coffee shop, the familiar chime above it barely registered, her mind still half a block away on that bench, replaying a conversation that had been simple on the surface but felt layered underneath. And she moved quickly behind the counter, tying her apron with practiced efficiency as the smell of freshly ground coffee wrapped around her like a routine she could rely on, something predictable in a life that rarely was. You are cutting it close today. Her coworker Lily called out from the espresso machine, her tone light but observant, and Sophie forced a small smile, nodding as she reached for a stack of cups. Bus was slow, she replied, the excuse automatic, easier than explaining something she did not fully understand herself. Because how did you explain a stranger who did not act like a stranger, someone who seemed to notice things no one else did, someone who did not fit into the neat categories her world depended on? And as the morning rush began to build, customers lining up with their usual orders and hurried energy, Sophie slipped into motion, calling out drinks, taking payments, moving from one task to the next with a rhythm that usually left no space for distraction. But today was different. Today her attention fractured in small, quiet ways. Every time the door opened, her eyes flickered up for just a second longer than necessary. Every unfamiliar figure triggering a brief spark of recognition that faded just as quickly, and she told herself it was nothing, just curiosity, just unfinished gratitude. But somewhere deeper it felt like something else, something she was not ready to name yet. You okay? Lily asked at one point, lowering her voice as she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing slightly in concern, and Sophie blinked, realizing she had been holding the same cup under the espresso machine a second too long. Yeah, just tired, she said, adjusting quickly, forcing her focus back into place as she handed off the drink. But even as she said it, she knew it was not entirely true, because tired did not explain the way her thoughts kept circling back to him, to Ethan, to the calm way he spoke, the precise way he observed, the quiet confidence that did not match the image he presented, and that contradiction lingered with her through every order, every interaction, until the rush finally began to slow, the line thinning out as the clock edged closer to mid-morning. And for the first time since she arrived, Sophie allowed herself a breath, stepping back from the counter as she wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze drifting toward the front windows, sunlight now fully breaking through the buildings across the street, casting long reflections on the glass. And then she saw it. Not him exactly, not at first, but something that made her pause, a figure standing just outside, partially turned away, his posture familiar in a way that immediately tightened her chest. And as if sensing her attention, he shifted slightly, turning just enough for the light to catch his face. And there he was again, Ethan, standing there like he had nowhere else to be. Like this was just another stop in a day that did not follow the same rules as hers. And Sophie felt that same quiet pull from earlier return, stronger now, less uncertain. Because this was no longer coincidence, not when it happened twice, not when the timing aligned too perfectly to ignore. And as she stood there, frozen for a brief second between responsibility and curiosity, something inside her made the decision before she could overthink it, because some moments do not wait for permission, they demand action, and this felt like one of them. Sophie did not remember making the decision to move. Only that 1 second she was standing behind the counter staring through the glass, and the next she was already pulling off her apron, her hands moving faster than her thoughts could catch up. I will be right back, she said quickly to Lily, who looked up in mild surprise, but nodded without questioning. And within seconds Sophie was pushing through the door, the small bell chiming again as the outside air hit her, sharper now under the rising sun. And he was still there, exactly where she had seen him, as if he had not moved at all, as if he had been waiting without calling it that. And when he noticed her approaching, there was that same calm shift in his expression, not surprise, not urgency, just quiet acknowledgement, like this moment had always been expected. "You came back," Sophie said, a hint of disbelief threading through her voice as she stopped a few feet in front of him, and Ethan glanced briefly toward the coffee shop behind her before returning his gaze to her. "It seemed like a place you might be," he replied, and something about the way he said it made her pause, because it sounded less like a guess and more like an observation, something he had already confirmed before stepping into view, and she folded her arms loosely, studying him again. The same coat, the same understated presence, but now under daylight, everything felt clearer, sharper, and yet somehow more confusing. "Do you always just show up where people work?" she asked, a slight edge of humor in her tone masking the curiosity underneath, and he tilted his head slightly, considering the question as if it deserved a real answer. "Only when I want coffee," he said, and this time she let out a small laugh, the tension easing again, but not disappearing, because the questions were still there, quietly building. "Then you should have come inside," she said, gesturing toward the shop. "It is kind of what we do," and he nodded once, a faint smile touching his expression. "I was deciding," he replied, and Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly. "Deciding what?" she asked, and there was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, just deliberate. "If I should interrupt your routine," he said, and the way he said routine made it sound like something he understood more than he should, and that detail did not go unnoticed. "It is just a job," she said lightly though. Her voice carried more weight than the words suggested, and Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a second longer, as if he was reading something beyond what she chose to say. "It does not look like just a job," he responded, and Sophie felt that land somewhere deeper than she expected, because he was right. It was not just a job. It was stability, survival, everything that kept her world from slipping further out of control. But she was not ready to unpack that with someone she had only met twice, even if those meetings felt strangely significant. So instead she shifted the conversation, reaching into her apron pocket that she had instinctively brought with her, pulling out a neatly folded $10 bill, the same amount he had placed on the table the night before. "I owe you this," she said, holding it out toward him, her expression firm but not defensive, and for the first time since she had known him, Ethan did not immediately respond, his eyes dropping briefly to the bill before returning to her face, something thoughtful passing through his expression. "You do not owe me anything," he said quietly, but Sophie shook her head, taking a small step closer, her hand still extended. "Yes, I do," she replied. And in that moment the exchange was not about money. It was about balance, about dignity, about not wanting to feel like she had been saved without having a say in it. And Ethan seemed to understand that without needing it explained, because after a brief pause, he reached out and took the bill, not reluctantly, not eagerly, just accepting it for what it represented. And as his fingers brushed against hers for the briefest second, there was a subtle shift in the air between them, something unspoken but undeniable, like the beginning of a connection neither of them had planned, but neither of them was stepping away from either. And as Sophie pulled her hand back, she realized that whatever this was, it was no longer just about a single moment in a restaurant. It was becoming something that had its own momentum, something that was quietly pulling them both forward whether they fully understood it or not. Sophie stood there for a second longer than necessary after he took the $10 bill, the space between them settling into something quieter but heavier, like the moment had shifted from chance into intention, and she cleared her throat lightly, glancing back toward the coffee shop, where she could see Lily watching through the window with unmistakable curiosity. "I really do have to get back," she said, though her voice carried a trace of reluctance now, and Ethan nodded as if he had expected that all along, his posture unchanged, steady, almost grounded in a way that contrasted sharply with the constant motion of the street around them. "Of course," he replied, but he did not step away, and neither did she, not immediately, because something about walking back inside felt like closing a door she had only just opened. "You should come in later," she added, the words leaving her before she fully considered them. "Coffee is better when you are not just standing outside, deciding." And there was a faint hint of a smile in her expression, something warmer than before, and Ethan's gaze held hers for a brief moment, something thoughtful passing through his eyes. "Then I will make a decision," he said. And there was a subtle weight to the way he said decision again, like it meant more than just choosing a drink, and Sophie nodded once, accepting that answer even if she did not fully understand it, before finally turning back toward the shop, pushing the door open and stepping inside, the familiar warmth wrapping around her again as the bell chimed overhead. But this time everything felt slightly different, like the world she had just stepped out of had followed her back in, lingering just beneath the surface of her routine. "Okay, who is that?" Lily asked immediately, leaning across the counter with a grin that was equal parts teasing and curious, and Sophie blinked, caught off guard by how quickly the question came. "Just someone I met," she said, reaching for her apron again, tying it around her waist with slightly less precision than usual. "Someone you met outside a fancy restaurant, and now he is showing up here," Lily pressed, raising an eyebrow, and Sophie hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to confirm there was more to this than she was ready to explain. "It is not like that," she said, though even to her own ears it sounded less convincing than she intended, and Lily let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "It is always like that," she replied, stepping back as another customer approached. But the look she gave Sophie before turning away lingered, filled with the kind of curiosity that would not disappear easily. And as Sophie moved back into her rhythm behind the counter, calling out orders and handing off drinks, she could still feel the awareness of him outside, like a quiet presence just beyond the glass, not intrusive, not demanding, but undeniably there. And every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the door, without thinking, each glance carrying a small, unspoken question, until finally, after what felt longer than it probably was, the door opened again, the bell chiming softly as a familiar figure stepped inside, and for a brief second the noise of the shop seemed to fade just enough for her to notice the shift. Because Ethan did not walk in like someone uncertain or out of place. He walked in like someone who had made a decision, calm, composed, and completely unbothered by the subtle glances that followed him. And when his eyes found hers across the room, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just that same steady acknowledgement, as if this next step had always been part of the plan, even if she had only just begun to realize she was part of it too. The bell above the door had barely finished ringing when Lily leaned closer again, her voice dropping just enough to carry a quiet edge of amusement. "Okay, he is definitely here for you." And Sophie did not respond right away, because her focus had already locked onto Ethan as he approached the counter, his pace unhurried, his expression unchanged, like stepping into this space was no different than sitting on that bench or walking away from that restaurant. And yet everything about him still felt slightly out of place in a way she could not explain, not because he looked uncomfortable, but because he looked too comfortable, like he belonged anywhere he chose to be. And that thought lingered as he reached the counter, standing directly across from her now, the noise of the shop continuing around them, but somehow fading just enough for the moment to sharpen. "So you decided," Sophie said, her tone light, but carrying a trace of curiosity she could not hide, and Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "I did," he replied, and for a brief second neither of them spoke, the pause stretching just long enough to feel intentional, before she glanced toward the menu board behind her, shifting slightly back into her role. "What can I get you?" she asked, the question routine, but the moment anything but, and he looked up at the menu, scanning it with a focus that seemed more analytical than casual, like he was processing more than just drink options. "What do you recommend?" he said. And Sophie blinked, caught slightly off guard by the question, because most people already knew what they wanted or at least pretended to. But there was no hesitation in his tone, no performance, just a genuine question, and she found herself considering it more seriously than she normally would. "If you want something simple, drip coffee is fine," she said, then added after a second. "But if you actually want something good, the vanilla latte is probably the safest choice." And there was a faint shift in his expression at that, almost like approval, though it was subtle enough that she could not be sure. "Then I will take your recommendation," he said, and Sophie nodded, turning slightly to prepare the order, her movements practiced but her awareness still split. Part of her focused on the machine, the measurements, the timing, and part of her still tuned to him, to the quiet presence he carried even in a space filled with noise. "Name for the order?" she asked over her shoulder, even though she already knew the answer, and there was a slight pause before he responded. "Ethan," he said, and hearing it again, in this setting, made it feel more real, more anchored, like this was no longer just a passing interaction but something with continuity, something that could not be dismissed as coincidence. And as she worked, Lily moved closer to the register, her eyes flicking between them with barely concealed interest, but Sophie ignored it, focusing instead on finishing the drink, sliding the cup across the counter toward him a moment later. "Vanilla latte," she said, and he reached for it, his fingers wrapping around the cup, pausing just briefly as if acknowledging the exchange beyond its surface meaning. "Thank you," he said, and there was a quiet sincerity in it that felt disproportionate to the situation, like he was thanking her for more than just the coffee, and Sophie felt that again, that subtle shift in the air between them, like something was building without either of them forcing it. And as he stepped aside to wait, taking a seat near the window, she found her attention drawn back to him again and again, not in a way that disrupted her work, but in a way that made everything else feel slightly less significant. And across the room, Ethan sat with the same composed stillness, his gaze occasionally drifting toward her, but never lingering long enough to draw attention. And yet the connection was there, quiet but undeniable, growing stronger with every passing second, and somewhere between the routine of her job and the unfamiliar pull of his presence, Sophie realized that this was no longer just curiosity. It was becoming something harder to ignore, something that was beginning to matter in ways she had not expected. And that realization carried both a sense of warmth and a quiet, underlying tension, because whatever this was, it was not simple, and deep down, she already knew that simple was not where this was going. It was sometime after the late morning lull when the shift in the air became impossible to ignore, not because anything obvious had changed, but because Sophie started noticing the details that did not quite fit together, the kind of details that slipped past most people but lingered just long enough to create questions. And it began with something small, almost insignificant, the way Ethan held his cup, not casually, not absent-mindedly, but with a kind of precision that suggested habit rather than preference, like every movement had been refined over time, and she told herself she was overthinking it, that people carried themselves differently for all kinds of reasons. But then it happened again, this time when a man in an expensive suit walked in, talking loudly on his phone, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic of the room as a few heads turned, and for a brief second, just a fraction of a second, Sophie saw something in Ethan's reaction, not surprise, not discomfort, but recognition, sharp and immediate, before it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by that same calm neutrality he always carried. And that moment stayed with her, because recognition like that did not come from nowhere. It came from familiarity, from shared spaces, from a world that did not match the one he appeared to belong to. And as she continued working, her attention divided again. She found herself watching him more closely now, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a growing sense that there was something she was missing, something just beneath the surface, and it revealed itself in fragments. The way he glanced at the door, not with uncertainty, but with awareness, as if tracking movement without effort. The way his posture never fully relaxed even when he was sitting still, like he was always prepared to move if needed. And then there was the detail that finally caught her off guard completely, his watch, partially hidden beneath the sleeve of his coat, something she had not noticed before, but now that she saw it, she could not unsee it, because, even with only a glimpse, it was clear it did not belong with the rest of his appearance. The design too refined, too deliberate, the kind of piece that people did not wear by accident. And Sophie felt a subtle tension rise in her chest. Not fear, not exactly, but something closer to realization, the kind that starts forming before the mind is ready to accept it. "You keep looking over there," Lily whispered suddenly, appearing beside her with a knowing expression, and Sophie blinked, pulling her attention back. "Do I?" she replied, though the answer was obvious, and Lily smirked slightly, glancing toward Ethan before leaning closer. "He does not look like the type who just hangs around coffee shops all day," she said, her tone light, but her observation sharp. And Sophie hesitated, because that was exactly it. That was the feeling she had not been able to put into words. "What type does he look like?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to Lily, and Lily shrugged. "Someone who is pretending not to be something else," she said, and that landed harder than Sophie expected, because it echoed too closely to the thoughts already forming in her mind. And as she glanced back toward Ethan again, their eyes met for a brief moment, and this time there was something different in his gaze, something that felt almost like he knew she was starting to see past the surface, like he had been waiting for that moment without forcing it. And Sophie felt her breath catch slightly, because whatever this was, whatever he was, it was not simple anymore, and the quiet certainty she had earlier began to shift into something more complicated, something that carried the weight of a question she could no longer ignore. Who was he really, and why did it feel like the answer was already closer than she was prepared to face? The rest of the shift passed in a blur that felt both slow and too fast at the same time, because once Sophie saw the cracks, she could not unsee them, and every glance toward Ethan only added more questions instead of answers, until finally the clock edged closer to the end of her shift, and the tension she had been quietly holding settled into a decision she could not avoid anymore. She needed to ask, not directly, not yet, but enough to understand what she was standing in the middle of. And as the last few customers filtered out and Lily disappeared into the back room, Sophie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter, her heart steady but her thoughts anything but, and Ethan noticed her immediately, setting his cup down with that same measured calm as she approached. "You have been here a while," she said, stopping across from him, her tone casual but her eyes more focused than before. And he nodded slightly. "I had time," he replied, and that answer, simple as it was, carried something underneath it, something that did not align with the idea of someone who had nowhere else to be. "Most people do not have that kind of time in the middle of the day," she said. And this time there was a pause, a real one, not just a conversational beat, but a moment where the air shifted, where the surface level exchange began to give way to something deeper, and Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady on hers. "Most people choose how they spend it," he said, and Sophie felt that response land differently, because it was not defensive, it was not dismissive, it was controlled, intentional, like he was giving her just enough without giving anything away, and she crossed her arms lightly, not as a barrier but as a way to ground herself. "You do not really fit the story you look like," she said quietly, the words coming out more direct than she had planned, and for the first time since she met him, something shifted more visibly in his expression, not a full reaction, but enough to confirm she had touched on something real, something he had been aware of all along. "And what story is that?" he asked, his tone even, but his attention sharper now, and Sophie held his gaze, not backing down, because at this point stepping away felt impossible. "Someone who just sits on benches, helps strangers, and spends hours in coffee shops with nowhere else to be," she said. And there was a brief silence after that, not uncomfortable, but charged, like both of them understood that the conversation had crossed into something that could not easily return to neutral, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting for just a second, before returning to her. "Appearances can be useful," he said, and that was it. Not an explanation, not a denial, just a statement that opened more doors than it closed, and Sophie felt a subtle shift inside her, because that confirmed it. There was something he was not saying, something deliberate, something chosen, and for a brief second she considered pushing further, asking directly, demanding clarity. But something held her back, not fear, but instinct, the sense that whatever truth he was holding would not come out under pressure. It would reveal itself when it was ready. And as she stood there, caught between frustration and curiosity, Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Does it change anything?" he asked, and the question caught her off guard, not because of what it asked, but because of what it implied, and Sophie hesitated, her mind searching for an answer that felt honest, not easy. "I do not know yet," she said finally, and that was the truth, because whatever this was, whatever he was, it had already changed something. She just did not know what that meant yet, and as they held each other's gaze in that quiet, suspended moment, it became clear that the line between what was real and what was hidden was no longer distant. It was right there between them, waiting to be crossed, and neither of them was stepping back. The question lingered between them longer than either of them expected, not because it demanded an immediate answer, but because it revealed something neither of them could easily take back. And Sophie felt it settle deep in her chest as she stepped away from the table, her shift technically over, but her mind far from finished. "I need to close out," she said quietly, more to create space than to end the conversation. And Ethan nodded without resistance, as if he understood the weight of what had just been said, as if he knew that pushing further now would only break something that was still forming. And as Sophie moved behind the counter again, going through the final motions of her routine, wiping surfaces, stacking cups, counting the register, everything felt slightly distant, like her body was following habit while her thoughts remained fixed on him, on the way he spoke, the way he chose what to reveal and what to hold back. And more than that, the way he had asked if it changed anything, because that question implied he knew it might, and that meant whatever truth he carried was not small. It was not simple. It was something that could shift the ground beneath her if she let it. "You are thinking too hard," Lily said as she reappeared, leaning casually against the counter, her eyes flicking toward Ethan before returning to Sophie. And Sophie let out a small breath, shaking her head slightly. "I think I am just starting to see things more clearly," she replied, and Lily raised an eyebrow, amused but curious. "That usually makes things more complicated, not less," she said. And Sophie did not argue with that, because she knew it was true. Clarity did not always bring comfort. Sometimes it just removed the illusion that things were simple. And when everything was finally done, when the last light behind the counter was switched off and the door was locked behind the final customer, Sophie stepped out from behind the counter one last time, her gaze immediately finding Ethan, who had not moved far, still seated, still waiting without calling it that. And she walked toward him slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. "We are closing," she said, her voice softer now, less guarded than before, and he stood as she approached, his posture straight but relaxed, like he had already decided what came next. "Then I should not keep you," he replied, but neither of them moved toward the door immediately, because leaving now felt like ending something unfinished, something that had only just begun to reveal its shape. "You never answered me," Sophie said after a moment, her eyes holding his, and he tilted his head slightly. "Which part?" he asked, though there was a faint awareness in his tone that suggested he already knew. "Why you are really here," she said, and this time the silence that followed was different, heavier, more intentional. And Ethan looked at her in a way he had not before. Not guarded, not distant, but measured, like he was deciding how much truth the moment could hold. "Because I wanted to be," he said finally, and Sophie felt a flicker of frustration rise, not because the answer was wrong, but because it was incomplete. "That is not the same as telling the truth," she replied, and for a second, something almost like a smile touched his expression, not amused, but acknowledging. "It is part of it," he said, and then he paused, just long enough to shift the weight of the moment again. "The rest would change things," he added, and Sophie held his gaze, her heart steady but her thoughts racing, because that was exactly what she had been afraid of. Not that he was hiding something, but that whatever he was hiding mattered enough to alter everything. And as they stood there in the quiet space of the closed shop, the city dimming outside the windows, it became clear that they were standing right at the edge of something neither of them could control anymore, something that was about to move forward whether they were ready or not. And for the first time since this began, Sophie felt the undeniable pull of a choice forming in front of her, not about him, but about herself, about whether she was willing to step into a truth that could change everything she thought she understood, about the world she was trying so hard to survive in. The night air outside felt different this time, heavier, like it carried the weight of something about to unfold, and Sophie stood just a step away from the door, her hand still resting lightly against the handle as she looked at Ethan, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass behind him, turning his silhouette into something almost unreal. And for a brief moment neither of them moved, not because they did not know what came next, but because they both understood that once it started, there would be no returning to the simplicity of what this had been. "You said it would change things," Sophie said quietly, her voice steady but softer now, not demanding, not defensive, just honest, and Ethan held her gaze. That same calm composure still there, but with something deeper underneath, something more resolved. "It will," he replied, And this time there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften the truth. And Sophie felt that answer settle into her, not as a warning, but as a confirmation of everything she had already begun to suspect. A black car pulled up slowly along the curb behind him, smooth and deliberate, its presence subtle but unmistakable, and Sophie's eyes flickered toward it instinctively, the polished surface reflecting the streetlights in a way that felt out of place in this part of the city. And when she looked back at Ethan, something had shifted, not in who he was, but in what he was no longer hiding. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath, and Ethan glanced over his shoulder for just a second before returning his attention to her. "The part one did not tell you," he said, and before she could respond, the rear door of the car opened quietly, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his posture precise, his expression professional but respectful, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said, his tone calm and direct, and the name landed in the air between them like a line being drawn, and Sophie felt her breath catch, not because the name itself meant something yet, but because of how it was said, with recognition, with deference, with certainty. And slowly her eyes shifted back to Ethan, searching his face for something that could anchor her understanding. But instead she found confirmation, quiet and undeniable. "You were not supposed to see it like this," Ethan said, his voice lower now, not apologetic, but honest in a way that carried weight. And Sophie took a small step back, not out of fear, but because the space between them suddenly felt different, charged with a truth she had not fully prepared for. "See what?" she asked, even though part of her already knew the answer was coming. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "The version of me that does not fit on a bench outside a coffee shop," he said, and the man by the car waited silently, not interrupting, not rushing, but clearly part of a world that operated on a different level than the one Sophie knew. And in that moment, everything began to connect: the watch, the awareness, the way he spoke, the way he chose his words, the way he carried himself like he did not need to prove anything to anyone. And Sophie felt a mix of emotions rise at once: confusion, realization, and something sharper underneath, something that felt dangerously close to betrayal, not because he had lied directly, but because he had allowed her to believe something that was never entirely true. "So what? Are you really?" she asked, her voice steady but edged now. And Ethan held her gaze, no longer avoiding the truth, no longer deflecting. "Someone who wanted to see who you were without everything else getting in the way," he said. And the honesty in that answer did not make it easier. It made it more complicated, because it meant this was not an accident. It was a choice. And as Sophie stood there, the city moving around them, the car waiting, the distance between their worlds suddenly undeniable, she realized that the moment she had been sensing since the beginning had finally arrived. The moment where everything shifted from possibility into reality, and nothing about it was simple anymore. The silence that followed his words was not empty. It was full, heavy with everything that had just been revealed and everything that still remained unspoken. And Sophie stood there with her arms slowly lowering to her sides, her eyes locked on Ethan as if looking away would make the truth less real, but it did not. It only made it sharper, clearer, undeniable. "So this was a test," she said finally, her voice steady but carrying the weight of something deeper, not anger exactly, but disappointment shaped by understanding. And Ethan shook his head slightly, stepping closer but not enough to close the distance completely. "No," he said quietly. "It started as curiosity." And he paused, choosing his next words carefully, not to protect himself, but to make sure they were real. "But it stopped being that the moment you chose to stand your ground when it would have been easier not to." And Sophie felt that land differently, not as an excuse, but as an acknowledgement, and she looked down briefly, her thoughts racing through every moment they had shared, every conversation, every small detail that now carried a different meaning. And when she looked back up at him, there was something new in her expression, not just confusion or frustration, but clarity forming in real time. "You let me believe you were something you are not," she said, and Ethan nodded once, accepting it without deflection. "I let you see me without everything that usually defines me," he replied. And there was a quiet honesty in that made it harder to dismiss, because it was not about deception for advantage. It was about removing the things that would have changed her behavior before she even knew him. And Sophie exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest shifting into something more grounded, more deliberate. "And what happens now?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, because this was no longer about what he was hiding. It was about what he was choosing to do with the truth now that it was out. And Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, the distance between them still there, but no longer uncertain. "Now you decide if it changes what you saw in me before you knew," he said, and that was it. No pressure, no promises, just the reality placed back into her hands. And Sophie stood there for a moment longer, the city moving around them, the car still waiting, the driver still silent, and she realized something that cut through everything else, the version of him she had met on that bench. The version who had stepped in without needing recognition, who had listened without judgment, who had shown up without expectation. That version had been real, not complete, but real, and that mattered more than she wanted to admit. "You could have just told me," she said softly, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not regret, but understanding. "If I had, you would have seen everything else first," he replied, and she knew he was right. Because the world she lived in had already taught her how quickly people were defined by what they had instead of who they were, and for a brief second she let that truth settle, letting it reshape the way she saw the situation, not removing the complication, but giving it context. And then she took a small step forward, closing just a fraction of the distance between them, enough to signal something without fully committing to it. "I do not like being kept in the dark," she said, her voice firm but no longer guarded. And Ethan nodded immediately. "Then I will not do that again," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no conditions, just a promise stated as simply as everything else he had said. And Sophie held his gaze, measuring that response, not for perfection, but for truth. And what she saw was not someone trying to impress her, but someone choosing to meet her where she stood, without hiding, without adjusting to gain approval. And that mattered, more than the car, more than the name, more than the world he came from. And as the moment stretched just a little longer, Sophie let out a small breath, the tension easing into something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of a choice rather than the end of a story. "Then maybe you can start by walking me home," she said, her tone lighter now, but still grounded in everything that had just happened. And for the first time since the reveal, Ethan allowed a real smile to form, subtle but unmistakable. "I would like that," he replied, and without another word, he turned briefly toward the car, giving a small signal that was immediately understood, the driver nodding before closing the door and stepping back, the vehicle pulling away smoothly into the night, leaving behind the version of him that came with it. And as Ethan turned back to Sophie, now standing beside her instead of across from her, the distance between their worlds no longer defined the moment, only the choice they were both making to step forward anyway. And together they began to walk, not towards certainty, not towards something simple, but towards something real, built not on status or assumptions, but on the quiet, deliberate decision to see each other clearly and stay. A quiet act of kindness inside a crowded restaurant sparks an unforgettable journey between a struggling young woman and a mysterious man who refuses to be defined by appearances. What begins as a simple moment of help quickly unfolds into one of the most emotionally gripping millionaire stories, where dignity, trust, and hidden truth collide in ways neither of them expected. The hardworking girl, juggling long shifts and personal burdens, believes she understands the world and her place in it, until the calm stranger who seems to have nothing slowly reveals that he is far more than he appears, challenging everything she thought she knew about status and identity. As their paths cross again and again in what feels like fate, their connection deepens through quiet conversations, subtle observations, and moments that feel real in a world full of judgment, turning this into one of those millionaire stories where emotional authenticity matters more than wealth. But beneath the surface, questions begin to rise, and when the truth finally breaks through with a powerful reveal involving a waiting car and a hidden identity, the girl is forced to confront whether what she felt was genuine or carefully constructed, pushing this story into the heart of unforgettable millionaire stories that explore trust and perception. Instead of falling into predictable patterns, The story challenges both characters to face their own assumptions, showing how kindness, respect, and integrity can bridge even the widest gaps between two worlds, making it stand out among modern millionaire stories that focus on emotional realism rather than fantasy. In the end, what truly matters is not the wealth or the status, but the choice to see someone clearly and stay, proving that the most powerful millionaire stories are not about money, but about the courage to love without illusion and the strength to build something real when everything else falls away. Character 1. A white male billionaire in his early 30s, wearing a simple dark coat and understated luxury watch. Calm, confident expression, front-facing portrait, natural lighting, realistic skin texture, sharp eyes, composed posture, modern city background, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. A white young woman in her mid-20s, wearing a simple cafe uniform and worn coat. Soft, expressive face, natural makeup, slightly tired eyes yet resilient, front-facing. Portrait, realistic lighting, authentic skin texture, urban background, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.